begin by talking about kids. Lots of us have them. We all used to be one. Sometimes we all still act like one. And in honour of this, I'm going to tell a joke that my 5-year-old just told me, and I haven't ever heard. I think it's fantastic. This polar bear goes into a bar, and she says, this is how my daughter says, she says to the barkeep, "Could I have a glass of lemon aid?" And the barkeep goes, "Sure, but why the big pause?" And the polar bear says, "I don't know, I've always had them." Isn't that good? That'd be Nina following in the family footsteps. Now, every parent today is grappling with all the usual problems, but also new issues like Facebook and mobiles and computers and all the things they throw up. And perhaps, I just think, I don't know whether it's true, I think it's probably true that there are more things that parents have little experience of because they didn't exist when they were kids today than at any other time in history. I mean, when I was a kid, my parents didn't have experience of certain things when they were a kid, like television wasn't really around when they were a kid and they had to work out that. But there are probably more things today and bigger changes that weren't part of parents' life as a kid or even as a grown-up for a long time than ever before. So are kids growing up too soon, and are the attitudes of parents sometimes part of the problem? Well, to tell us about this, Maggie Hamilton is a writer, a social researcher, publisher, and most relevantly, author of 2 companion books, What's Happening to Our Boys and What's Happening to Our Girls. Please welcome Maggie Hamilton.
I walked out on the playground, much to my surprise. Everyone was playing, kids
Hello,
were
everybody.
sharing, taking
It's truly wonderful to be with you today to share a little of my research into boys and girls in the 21st century. Because I think it's really important we understand a little bit more about this. I have to warn that some of this is a little bit graphic. This is not because I try to go around the country scaring people, but I think there's probably a lot we need to know. So let's get into it. One of the first things I found when I started to do my research into the kids is we tend to talk about this new generation as if it's one big lump, but in fact it's not. What I found is that there are lots of nuances within this new generation. What do I mean by that? Well, what a 12-year-old girl was experiencing when she was 9 is not what a 9-year-old is now experiencing, aspiring to, etc. So when we talk about this newer generation, it's very important we realize there are lots of nuances in this because things are moving so quickly. The second thing that really hit me as I started to get into the research is how different the climate is for our kids now. They are living in a performance culture. Life is a performance. It's where you're expected to be amazing 24/7. Can you imagine the pressure that puts on our children? And we're not just talking about teenagers here. A very relentless culture where the rules are changing all the time. And what I found was our kids are spending so much time trying to find out what they're meant to be doing at any one time, wearing, etc. So we've got this very stressful environment happening for a lot of our children. What I also discovered was, well, one of the most saddening things is that advertisers now know how to product place from 6 months. And this is how they do it. They realise that when little children start to sit up, they dribble a lot. And when they dribble, they stare down at their dribble for extended periods. Now, I don't know why babies find that so exciting, but I can tell you, if you're 6 months, it's pretty cool. And so what the advertisers realised was all those brands, all those branded fun figures we're aware of, Bob the Builder, Thomas the Tank, etc., if you put those on a baby's bib, in a certain place, their t-shirt on the crotch of their nappies, you begin product placement at 6 months. And they did their homework and they realised that if you get this into the home at 6 months, by the time a child is 2, you take it into a shopping centre, into a supermarket, and it will recognise those fun figures, even though it might not have the language for it. And how does it work? Well, its little face lights up with recognition. We get this lovely dopamine fix and we can't get our hands into our wallets quickly enough to buy all the product. And most important, we buy the DVDs, which are basically animated ads. We take them home and we bung our little boys and girls in front of these DVDs and we play them over and over and over again. Another thing that I discovered as I was doing the research was that marketing, of course, is progressing all the time. And we now have something else that we need to contend with our children. And this is called cradle-to-grave marketing. And this is where they realise that many of the manufacturers who have products for teenagers, that if they start to shove those product lines right down the age groups to as early as possible, in some cases a year, 18 months, then you get a whole lot more income. More important than that, they actually cost it out for every brand who manages to capture a little child that they are probably worth 100,000 to that brand for life. So already our children are being marketed to from very young and they have a price on their heads. And so what we find is that we have children growing up in rooms full of branded junk, not experiencing life, certainly not getting out into the beauty of nature and connecting with earth. And what we know from neuroscience is to grow our children's brain, to grow our children mind, body and spirit, they need to be connecting to the world directly. In other words, funnily enough, they need to be having those old-fashioned childhoods that some of us were lucky enough to have, those of us who've been around a little while. So they call this phenomenon kids getting older younger, which is just another way of saying that childhood is under threat at the moment. When I discovered this, I have to say I was pretty upset about it, but I thought there's no point in being upset. You've got to go out and talk to the people who know. So I went to talk to preschool professionals and others who are working with children at preschool, and I said to them, have you noticed any changes with children from a few years ago? And the first thing they said is we're seeing a massive rise of anxiety. We're talking children here 3 to 5. What are they anxious about? Do I have the right brand of backpack, lunchbox, etc.? The second thing they said is that they're noticing already the concerns of body image are starting at 3, 4 and 5. The children are also getting the message, of course, that I am what I own, not who I am and what I have to offer the world. Another thing that I found very alarming was that there is a massive drop in imagination, according to these people. The children are not playing imaginative play, they are playing in the preschool yards the scripts of the DVDs they have seen over and over. Now we know imagination is one of the great life skills. It's about understanding we have choices, how to deal with difficult situations and people, how to have a vision. This is collapsing. And what we're also seeing is that our children are becoming very, very immature, or in fact they're staying in that immature stage, I should say, because they're not getting that life experience, being in the community, having lots of experiences to grow the life experience. And so they're staying in that stage where it's all about me, and I have to have it, and I have to have it now, and I have to be told I'm wonderful all the time because I'm not having any kind of inner life. So this is very difficult for our little ones. What we're now also seeing with the marketers is that they are really honing in on younger and younger children. We're seeing in magazines where they're now starting to compare the clothing of little tiny tots. We see another thing with the advertising to our little ones, and it's a very subtle message which has a lot of attitude attached to it. And the message is that your parents are idiots. What would your teachers know? Come to us, buy the sunnies, buy the board shorts. We talk your language. We don't mind being edgy. We understand you. So what we're seeing now with the advertising to our young kids is that there is an active undermining of the gatekeepers and nurturers. What we see with the corporations is that they take the anxieties of our children, their aspirations, and they sell this back to them in terms of products. So if we look at the video games, for instance, what that's appealing to is a little boy's desire to be a hero. And what we give them instead of those real-life experiences increasingly are these very, very violent virtual games. If you talk to preschool teachers again, they say that Ben 10 is a huge curse because of the amount of violence they're now seeing with little boys in the playground. And of course, all this undermines the happiness and the growth of our children, mind, body and spirit. Perhaps more disturbing than that is the sexualization of our children very, very early on. This is not just happening to teenagers anymore. any little boy who can find his way around the net at 5 or 6 will find these free games. This is one where girls' breasts literally explode on the screen. You'll notice that they have very young faces. There are other games where you look up a teacher's skirt or down her top. It's called Naughty Classroom. There's a stripping game where, as you get points, you can actually strip the girls. And this is actually impacting on the kinds of behaviours we're now seeing in primary school, where we are starting to see sexual abuse and sexual coercion. If we take something like Grand Theft Auto, which many, many children have, we actually have the killing of prostitutes, we have the killing of cops, and so on. So it's patterning our boys to be violent instead of that real-life adventure. When I talk to boys and girls about, but particularly boys, about why the video games attract them, it's very interesting. Often they're alone for long periods, so it fills in the loneliness. It's a de-stressing thing, but also it's that sense of power. But as we know, it's a very false sense of power. As our kids become more and more lured into the virtual world, then what we're also finding is we're finding a generation now who are overstimulated and finding it very, very hard to sleep. When I was interviewing the boys particularly, but this certainly happens to the girls as well, they would often say they didn't get to bed till 1 or 2 in the morning. This is a school week and a school day, and they said that they would then find themselves in a situation where they would actually have to lie there for a couple of hours before they actually got to sleep. So this is impacting that nourishment of the body to be able to replenish. If we look at our little girls for a minute, the sexualization is starting long before teenage life. This is poor little Noah Cyrus, who's 8. And she recently launched some new products in the States, and this is how she was dressed. One of the concerns globally in terms of the sexualization of our children is the growth in child trafficking. And what we're now seeing is we're seeing in the advertising of our little girls a definite sexual element creeping in that we really not only have to be aware of but speak out about. Here we have 2 recent ads from Witchery featuring a 5- and 6-year-old little girl. So what this is creating is adultified behaviour. You've all heard of sexting and inappropriate messages and photos being sent around. This is not only happening at high school, I'm afraid. This is happening in primary schools right across the country from little girls 8 up. I think one of the things as we look at all this is those of us who've been around a bit longer, we grew up on stories of valour, the depression and war, self-sacrifice, striving and so forth. And I think it's incumbent upon us to really fight the news stories that our children are experiencing, which have no transcendence, which do not talk about the realities of life, but give a very shallow life story to our children. One of the things that I notice with the children also coming into the teens and very much in the teens is the way they look at ads as kind of text as how to be. So if we take this corny ad for Cornetto, for instance, we see 2 guys, and it's not just about having a cornetto, it's about how your hair should be, your t-shirt, etc. So we look at ads and see one thing, but our children actually read them as scripts of how to be. Continually, the advertising subtexts are getting more and more risque and are giving our children lots of cues for how they should be behaving in ways that are really, really disturbing. This is one of the many Calvin Klein ads that are to be very concerned about. When we look at reality TV, we see that it is a very psychologically cruel situation and that a lot of our kids take on board reality TV as kind of, again, a life script, which creates a lot of bullying. The problem for us as adults is that we see these kinds of billboards all the time, but we don't realise the impact. So we have to start reclaiming the public spaces. When we start to look at things like sexting and we see it through our children's eyes, we actually realise that if they get involved in this stuff, it's not so much because they're trying to be naughty, but because they're trying to perform to stay ahead. And of course, when you've got girls' magazines for very young girls with these kinds of ads at the back, it doesn't help. The celebrity culture, which encourages dysfunction. And when we start to look at some of their greatest icons, Jenna Jameson, who's a porn star, Snoop Dogg, who is a pimp, we realise that our children are constantly being put into a situation of toxicity. I want to talk for a minute about the new sexy, because this is really perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of where we're at the moment. We all know Lady Gaga. Pornography is changing. It is not just about arousal anymore and sexual expression. It is also about torture. And so we're now seeing, slipping into popular culture, the influence of porn very strongly, which is violence and sex. And this is very much what Lady Gaga is about. In her recent concert, she came here and she came down a rope dripping in blood. In her recent video, she actually simulated a gang rape scene. And for anybody who didn't quite get what was going on, there's a big red arrow. This stuff is out there all the time. For the Lady Gaga concerts, we had little clusters of girls going as young as 9 without parents. The thing about porn is that it is a massive industry. Do you know that it is actually now rivaling the amount of money made by sport worldwide? And every new advance that we see in technology, whether it's 3D films or whatever, immediately goes into the porn situation. And what it does is it creates a predatory kind of attitude towards girls. We now have internet sites where people are encouraged, if they see a drunk girl, not to take her home to her parents, but to get their mates around and a camcorder and have a good time on her, which of course is code for rape, and then post that on the net. So this whole thing of sex and violence in pornography, which we're now seeing where people are multiply penetrated, etc., etc. By the way, the life of the average porn star is 3 months, because after that they are so physically damaged, not to mention psychologically. They can't do the work anymore. So what we're seeing now is the attitude behind this slipping into popular culture. So we're seeing T-shirts like this, and this T-shirt here that's available in Roger David stores, and there's many, many examples of this. So we really have to understand this is the kind of toxic environment that our kids are aware of through the internet, through the talk of friends. And of course, porn now is becoming very much a group activity for boys to watch together in the way they used to watch footy. I'm sorry to talk about this because it is hard and it's difficult. But childhood is such a beautiful and precious thing. It is the growing of our new generation, mind, body, and spirit. And we have to be engaged with these dark things if we are to change them. Recently, America's Next Top Model show and Australia's Next Top Model show also was influenced by this whole porn situation, when they actually had their models model being dead victims of crime. So we had girls who'd been shot, who'd been dismembered, etc., looking pretty. So we're seeing this continually creep into different areas of popular culture. I wouldn't talk about this if I didn't feel there was lots of hope. There is. Every generation has its challenges with our children, and this is ours. The thing is, our children are not the problem. It's the fact that we have allowed this toxicity to creep into our culture, and we have to be courageous enough to stand up and say this is not what we want for our beautiful boys and girls. It still takes a village to raise our children. And so the big question is, as you look at the children in your life, what sort of village are you creating for them? What really came across when I talked to the kids is how much they love